Good morning. It's Wednesday, October 9th. The multi-front war in the Middle East is now 369 days old. I'm Jonathan Schanzer, Senior Vice President for Research at Foundation for Defensive Democracies. Welcome back to the FDD Morning Brief. Well, I can't begin to cover what happened overnight. Rumors of a possible ceasefire with Iran, rumors that the United States is trying to buy off Iran with $6 billion. Rockets falling in the north and actually claiming the lives of Israelis, a stabbing attack in Hadera. Defense Minister from Israel, Gallant, is on his way to Washington. Bibi and Biden are about to speak after weeks of giving each other the silent treatment. Biden has apparently been using the F word a lot in describing his Israeli counterpart. And by the way, I don't mean the word fire truck. I needed more than my usual 2 cups of coffee to take all of this in. And quite frankly, coffee may not be enough. But here's something else as of 2 days ago. The protests are back. After a relatively quiet first month of the school year, that quiet was shattered. Here at FDD, we continue to track the professional organizers. They are full-grown men. And yes, I'm aware that free speech extends to adults as well as to college students. But let's do a quick thought experiment here. Let's imagine that the protesters were spewing hate towards African Americans or the LGBTQ plus community. And then let's further posit that the organizers were discovered to hail from groups previously shut down by the federal authorities because they were associated with white nationalists. You know that these protests wouldn't last. And just so we're clear, the key organizers of these anti-Zionist and anti-Semitic hate fests have well-documented ties to groups previously shut down here in America for financing Hamas. We're going to keep tracking that right here at FDD. Today's special guest on the FDD Morning Brief is Brian Katulis. He's a senior fellow for U.S. foreign policy at the Middle East Institute, a think tank based in Washington, D.C. Previously, Brian worked at the Center for American Progress. He's also worked at the National Security Council, the U.S. Departments of State and Defense, and he also lived in both the West Bank and Gaza for the National Democratic Institute. Really interesting story there. He's one of the founders of a super interesting publication called The Liberal Patriot, which calls balls and strikes on U.S. foreign policy without fear or favor. It's that kind of nonpartisanship that we endorse here at the FDD Morning Brief. I have a confession to make. I'm sleeping better lately than I have during most of the war. It's not because I'm no longer news obsessed, and I certainly haven't stopped worrying about worst case scenarios. My worst fears stem from what I knew about the war that was certain to erupt in the north. There was no doubt it was coming from my perspective. The briefings FDD has received over the years from Israeli officials were terrifying. The 200,000 Hezbollah rockets that could saturate Israel's airspace and overwhelm its missile defense systems, the precision-guided munitions that could topple Israeli skyscrapers or take out key Israeli infrastructure. These were the scenarios that we were told to expect. Thankfully, so far, none of the nightmare scenarios have played out. The war in the north kicked off in a drastically different way. The Israelis went on the offensive and destroyed much of Hezbollah's most dangerous capabilities. Israel has eliminated many of Hezbollah's top leaders. Iran's most powerful proxy is in total disarray. Israel is not letting up, and at the same time, they have been surgical. They have carefully targeted their enemy without making new enemies out of the Lebanese people. That all said, past performance is not an indicator of what the future may hold. The hard part may just be beginning. Hezbollah has more capabilities that we haven't seen yet, and don't forget that Iran may have something to say about all of this too. Whatever happens next, you can be sure of one thing. We have entered a new phase of the 10-7 wars. Now for your headlines. Headline 1, on the anniversary of October 7th, the U.S. Treasury imposed sanctions on a Hamas financing network. Treasury designated 4 individuals. 3 of them are based in Europe, 1 in Germany, 1 in Austria, and 1 in Italy. The 4th individual is a man named Hamid al-Ahmar. He's a Yemeni national based in, wait for it, Turkey. Al-Ahmar is a key member of a Hamas investment fund that at its height managed more than $500 million in assets. That's billion with a B. Al-Ahmar also oversees a network of sham charities and front companies. Treasury imposed sanctions on 9 of them this week. Hamas uses these so-called charities to funnel money to the terrorists in Gaza. Treasury estimates that Hamas may have collected as much as $10 million per month through these sham operations. Oh, and by the way, FDD often shares information about shady financial networks we track with the Treasury Department. I'm not going to tell you who or what among our targets got sanctioned over the years, but we're always happy to see our work being used by the right people in the right places. Headline 2, Israel eliminated senior Hezbollah official Suhail Hussein Husseini. He was the commander of Hezbollah's Beirut headquarters. From his post in Beirut, Husseini oversaw the group's logistics, budgets, operations, and distributing Iranian weapons to Hezbollah's various units. He was essentially the chief operating officer of Hezbollah, and now he's no longer living. Very sad. In addition to Husseini, another Hezbollah bit the dust yesterday. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu confirmed that the IDF eliminated senior Hezbollah official Hassan Safiuddin. He was the man that was set to replace Hassan Nasrallah as Hezbollah's leader. Israel targeted Safiuddin in an underground bunker on October 3rd. He hasn't been heard from since. Also very sad. Headline 3, the Houthis in Yemen fired at least one missile at central Israel yesterday. Sirens sounded from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Ben Gurion Airport temporarily shut down its operations. The IDF confirmed that the Air Force intercepted one missile and no damage was reported. But the Houthis are telling a different story. According to the Iran-backed group, they fired not one, but two missiles at central Israel. The Houthis said that one of the missiles reached its target. The Houthis also said they targeted central city of Jaffa and the southern city of Eilat with several drones. And headline 4, bonus headline, Hamas leader Khalid Meshal says he is optimistic about Hamas's future. In an interview with Reuters, Meshal said that Hamas continues to recruit fighters and manufacture weapons. The terror group, he said, will rise like a phoenix from the ashes. Okay. Where was Meshal when he sat for this interview? Yeah, you know where this is going. He's based in Qatar. For more than a decade, Meshal has lived there, where he has amassed a net worth of some $4 billion while serving as a senior official in Hamas's Politburo. Can someone please explain why the Biden administration continues to tout Qatar as a major non-NATO ally as the emirate shelters Hamas terrorists? It is long past time to reset Washington's relationship with Doha. U.S. officials can start by demanding that Qatar extradite Khalid Meshal. The man has blood on his hands. Okay, it's now time for our conversation with Brian Katulis, otherwise known as the Katulifate. Brian is a Phillies fan, which means he may be a little grumpy this morning, but he agreed to put on his happy face to discuss foreign policy. Brian used to work for the Center for American Progress, an organization that definitely doesn't agree with FDD's perspective on the world. He now works for the Middle East Institute, which probably doesn't agree with our views on everything. But Brian and I have known each other for a long time now, and I'm a big fan of the pragmatic way he approaches foreign policy. It's all balls and strikes with him. So let's get into it right now on the FDD Morning Brief. Welcome, Brian Katulis.
Hey, Jonathan, what's going on?
Good to have you. All right, I want to start with your recent work. You have written 4 reports over the past year about how the Biden White House has handled the Middle East. What is the main takeaway in terms of lessons learned for the United States in the Middle East here?
Well, there are a lot of lessons. I don't know if they're learned, but the main headline is the headline of the last report, which is strategic drift. Essentially, what I say is that the United States over the last year has been largely a bystander to events. It's played an important role in constraining outcomes, as we saw in April with the CENTCOM and U.S. military trying to make sure that this exchange between Israel and Iran didn't get out of hand. But by and large, the Biden team, and this is not particular to them, has been reactive to events and trends in the region, reactive to the actions of Iran and its proxy network, but also largely reactive to Israel as it's been trying to defend itself. It's stated several goals. I tried to analyze on a quarterly basis, more or less, what they tried to do over the past year and gave them grades. And the grades aren't great. They've gone down. And the last thing I'd say, if you look at the report, which you can find at mei.edu, is that those grades actually get under the skin of some very senior Biden administration officials who reach out and aren't happy about that, because I think some of them are guys that are gals who mostly got A's in Ivy League schools and places like this. So it's not, they don't like to see sort of calling balls and strikes in this sort of way.
Yeah, don't give anybody anything less than a B if they went to some of those schools. If you can, I mean, what were the big grades, quarterly? If you were to give an overall grade to the administration quarter by quarter, 4 of them in a row, what would they be?
Well, I broke it down to several categories. You could look at the report, but I think the first leading goal, and some people will dispute this, but I think the Biden administration in the United States, with strong bipartisan support, had placed supporting Israel's self-defense and its goal of eliminating Hamas as a top priority. You can sort of quibble over words, but indeed, in terms of arms shipments and offering support, it's there, right? And that grade has been fairly strong, but it's gone down recently. Same sort of thing on securing the release of hostages. That was, I think, and is still and should be a top priority, especially since there are 4 Americans in addition to all the Israelis that are held by these maniacs in Hamas. And that grade has gone down in part because since May, the Biden team had made the ceasefire and hostage release negotiations. It was working through Egypt and Qatar as a top priority, and it didn't succeed. But on other fronts, protecting civilians in Gaza, but then also humanitarian aid, and now civilians in Lebanon, lower and lower grades. And then the idea of a post-war reconstruction. Again, this is a challenge for the Biden team. I think it's a challenge also inside the Israeli government, as you've noted and seen a big debate about what do we do sort of post-war in Gaza, and there's no consensus there.
Yeah, and I would argue, by the way, that the Israelis, their strategy probably also gets some fairly middling grades when you look at how the Israelis have adapted. Of course, they didn't ask for 10-7. They didn't know what was going to happen. But I would argue that they didn't have much of a strategy until probably about a month ago. And maybe I'd start to give them some better grades now.
But I would say on the post-war, no. And I think it's a problem that'll plague them in Lebanon, which is how do you actually strengthen structures and create structures so that you don't have a permanent occupation of Gaza or southern Lebanon, because the Israelis for years had that, and it didn't actually improve their security position. So I think that's the toughest nut to crack for them. And then I think the U.S. as its partner.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. These are tough questions, obviously not answered, but sometimes you got to finish fighting a war before you can start figuring out what happens after. That's not something that the administration has been particularly patient about. And by the way, probably not a lot of people in Washington either. But let me move on to, let me ask you another question. You've personally done a lot of work writing and editing over the last few years, trying to rebuild what we would call the vital center in American politics, advancing a stable foreign policy in the Middle East and beyond. How's that working out for you so far?
Yeah, it's not working out at the elite level very well because we're in this bubble. You know this. We're on a podcast here. We both work at think tanks in D.C. But when you step out of that bubble and you listen to what ordinary Americans want, especially when it comes to security and especially to the Middle East, there's actually a great deal more consensus in their views than you see in Congress, in between administrations, whether it's Republican and Democrat, and then importantly on the so-called thought leaders in think tanks, and then importantly what's been the new dynamic is advocacy organizations that are trying to push certain views, whether it's pro-Palestinian, pro-Israel, and things like this. So there's more consensus, as we've seen on China, I think a little bit until recently, on Ukraine. On the Middle East, this is the toughest, I think, nut to crack. We'll talk about the intra-democratic divide, I hope, on Israel. But by and large, if you step out of that bubble, most people see, as the Democratic nominee said the other night, Iran as a leading threat, right? She actually ranked Iran higher than China in her 60 Minutes interview as a leading adversary. And that's more reflective of an attitude that's out there in the public, but strangely is not in the expert class. But despite all of that, and you and I have a friendship, I have friendships with folks who are on the other side of the aisle, more conservative. I actually find those conversations a lot more interesting than those who are in my own tribe, so to speak, when it comes to actually enlightening my own view and shaping it and trying to build a consensus. But the problem is you have too many people who sort of operate, especially weeks before an election, in such a way that doesn't build that consensus and relationship capital that helps any administration to actually get big things done, whether it's Israel and Palestine and Iran or Lebanon. And in some ways, we're our own worst enemy, those divisions.
Oh, I absolutely agree. And I often look back at the Cold War era as a time where Democrats and Republicans largely agreed on the major foreign policy threats. And you didn't see significant swings back and forth, so that we didn't see that kind of confusion among the American people. By the way, we also didn't see that confusion among our allies. We certainly hear it now. I'm sure you've heard some of the same things when you travel to the region, where countries in the Persian Gulf and beyond are saying, look, we don't even know what one administration is going to do to the next. And we're getting whiplash here. And I think all of that is not exactly healthy.
Yeah.
But let me ask you a separate question. We obviously have an election approaching here in the United States. How do you think the war in the Middle East may impact our elections here at home?
I think it could affect it on the margins, but the central dynamic is here at home. The number one issue still is the economy. There's social policy divides, as we see on abortion, transgender questions, immigration, and things like this. So if you look at, there are certainly loud vocal voices on many different sides of this divide right now. And in certain swing states, it might matter. And you see these reports, like in yesterday's New York Times, there was one about Arab American voters in Michigan. But I'm a bit skeptical that it'll actually be the tipping point in this particular election, in part because you look at the prioritization. Most Americans, again, aren't focusing on these sorts of issues. If anything, the sense of chaos that Trump has talked about in the world and things were safer when he was there, that's part of his narrative. The wars sort of reinforce that. But most Americans just want a steady leader that actually kind of sort of knows what they're talking about, isn't in bed with sort of autocrats, and actually has been engaged in some sort of way. And I think it's probably not going to be as big of a factor in terms of what shapes the outcome as people might think in the region. And that's sort of sad when you think about it, because things that are very much existential, and these wars are existential, in some ways are just incidental in the United States. They're on the margins, and it's sad to think in that sort of way, but it's the gap. And it's quite different than, say, 2006, when the Iraq War was the number one political issue, in part because Americans were seeing people coming home in body bags, 100 a month or so, because our troops were in the middle of it. And that's not the case right now. There's really not that much cost directly to the United States to these wars. But I would argue if they're not dealt with, if we don't win and help our allies win, then we're actually going to see higher costs in the longer run.
I fully agree. And on that point, I want to just talk for a minute about the way the Democrat Party deals with Israel. This is sort of a love-hate relationship. We're hearing about it right now, where Biden is dropping the F-bomb, talking about Bibi. He's obviously very frustrated. What is the essence of the problem here in your view? I
think there's three things. Number one, you mentioned Bibi, and I think he and his crew has played partisan politics in the United States for more than a decade. That's been bad for Israel, and that's been bad for the United States. Using sort of this bilateral relationship as a partisan wedge issue, it goes back to, about 10 years ago or so, and people can fault Obama, but the reality is there was a 10-year deal that he struck with Israel to give them security support. There was all sorts of things, yet Bibi and his crew have not built the trust and confidence. Second, I think it's not just about him, but there's other leaders inside of Israel, and then the changes that were attempted in Israel's political system before 10/7, that provoked a big debate about whether this is a country that actually reflects U.S. values, and that was especially strong, I think, in Jewish American community. And then third and last but not least is I do think that there are a lot more empathetic voices in the Democratic camp towards the Palestinian people, right? And you would argue, and in some of the things you say, which I think is a little loose, about like, well, they're pro-Hamas or pro-terrorist. And I actually think there's a genuine strand. I consider myself one of them, because I have dear friends who I've lived with and worked with in Gaza and places like this, who are just ordinary Palestinians. You want to see something different. And I think Democrats, for whatever reason, are more empathetic towards that. And the Republican Party find it harder these days. There are some voices to talk about that. And to me, the only long-term solution is one that actually makes Israelis feel secure, but then also Palestinians feel secure. I still think the formulation of the two-state, though it seems so far off, especially a year after 10/7, is the one that we should strive for, because I can't imagine anything else, a formula that doesn't reaffirm the security and dignity of a Jewish democratic state in Israel, but also the security and dignity of the Palestinian people as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think you and I, obviously, we're going to disagree on some of those voices out there in the Democratic Party that have been parroting Hamas talking points and out there, in some cases actually supporting Hamas adjacent or pro-Hamas policies. And we certainly see some of that. And that's really the primary concern. Those that express that kind of empathy for the Palestinians, I think there are plenty of people, I hope anyway, across the political divide here in Washington that would want to see a two-state solution, want to see an equitable solution for all sides. I do want to just ask you quickly, as we start to wrap up, about the current approach by this White House to Iran. It's remarkably similar to the Obama administration's approach, and it's built on the premise in some ways that Iran can somehow be persuaded to become a responsible actor in the Middle East. Is this possible in your estimation right now?
It doesn't seem likely, because it's not only Iran not being a responsible actor in the Middle East. You see what it's doing to support Russia's war in Ukraine, which is a war that I think we should fight. And it's a war that funding for that was held up mostly by the conservatives and Mike Johnson in the House because of the immigration question. So I think Iran, there is a dominant strand in the Democratic Party and in this administration that essentially doesn't have a plan B. They came into office and said, we want to rejoin the Iran nuclear deal, and they delisted the Houthis in Yemen. But they basically pursued the same approach that Obama and I would argue Trump had in the region when it came to Iran's aggression in the region, which is passive appeasement. When Iran attacked Saudi Arabia in 2019, in Abqaiq, there wasn't any response. A few months later, yes, there was a strike on Qasem Soleimani, but there wasn't a steady approach to actually deal with the militias and the terror groups that Iran has dealt with in the region. We see Israel's now taking matters into its own hand right now. So I think the current approach is sort of drift. It's the headline of my latest report about the broader Middle East policy. But what I think, and I'll close on this, is that I don't think we're going to have even better Iran policy if we go back to the debates of 2013, 14, 15, where red versus blue or Republicans versus Democrats actually split themselves in different ways. And that requires new thinking by Democrats, which is something I'm trying to do. Again, it's not my main job, but it requires new thinking and new ways of building coalitions from the mindset of Republicans as well. And I don't think we're going to get there unless we actually build more of a consensus about the threat that Iran does pose, and then the best way to approach it.
Yeah. And that consensus, that is exactly where you and I absolutely agree. And I think we're just going to have to hope that we can at least build some kind of nonpartisan view on the Iranian threat as we head into a next administration. We're going to leave it there. I want to thank you for joining us today on the FDD Morning Brief. Brian Katulis.
Go Phillies.
Go Phillies. All right, here's what FTD has on tap for you today. My colleague David May is out with a piece in the National Interest on South Africa's latest pro-Hamas outrage. Get this, the former apartheid state is considering renaming Johannesburg's iconic Sandton Drive home to the U.S. consulate after PFLP terrorist Layla Khalid. Khalid is infamous for the hijacking of 2 civilian airliners. This actually seems pretty on brand given South Africa's fervent embrace of Hamas and the country's sponsorship of the lawfare being waged against Israel since the 10/7 attacks. My colleague Joe Truzman has some new work out in FTD's Long War Journal. He lays out the who's who of the Houthi terrorist group and its leadership. Don't try to say who's who of the Houthis too many times fast. Joe goes through the Rolodex of which leaders are already designated and who's ripe for sanctions. It's time we make these thugs pay a price for their attacks on commercial and military vessels in the Red Sea, missile attacks against Israel, and more. And finally, FDD's Mark Montgomery is out with a new FDD insight. He provides several examples of Beijing's use of lawfare in the U.S. court system. Monty explains how the courts are proving to be a battleground in numerous national security fights, including over the government's forced sale of TikTok from its CCP owners. America must wake up to China's manipulation of the law and respond accordingly. And that, my friends, is a wrap for today. Read our expert analysis on our website, FDD.org. Read our quick takes on X @FDD. Check out our Instagram and YouTube channels and support our work with a tax-deductible donation at FDD.org/invest. Tune in Friday for another installment of the FDD Morning Brief. Our guest will be Anna Borshevskaya, who tracks the activities of Russia across the Middle East. So we'll speak to her about Moscow's meddling in the current war, but we'll also continue to track that potential Israeli airstrike on Iran. It's like watching paint dry at this point, but I think we all know it's coming. Thanks for joining us. I'm Jonathan Schanzer, signing off for FDD.